Let's get right to this month's interview. This time we're talking with Dr. Warren Farrell. He's the author of Why Men Are the Way They Are. Now, for years, you and I have been hearing about the war of the sexes and how they're tearing up each other. You know, I used to listen to that type of thing and think, come on, give me a break. I have great relationships with women and great relationships with men. That doesn't mean anything. It's a bunch of fluff. But the reality is 1 out of 2 marriages end in divorce. 65 to 70%, depending upon whose polls you believe in, of all polls say that men and women in a relationship are unhappy with each other who are married. That's not too terribly exciting. What it says to me is that as much as we know, we must not know enough about each other's needs to make our relationships last, to make them passionate, to make them loving. And so Warren Farrell, when I first was exposed to his book, a friend gave it to me and said, you got to really read this book. And I thought, oh no, another one of those books about why men are the way they are, why women are the way they are, why this person's a jerk, why do you always attract the terrible person for your life? And I kind of generalized on it, but I got to tell you, it's different. Warren has tremendous insight that comes from 20 years of interviewing groups of men and women and approaching the relationship with men and women's needs with a level of precision and commitment and focus like you've never heard before. This man has approached it like being a detective, as if he was from another planet and knew nothing. And he's based all of his research during those 20 years on real people's real lives, and not just what they said they wanted or needed in a relationship, but spending enough time to find out what people really want and what they really need, which people rarely verbalize up front. He's also studied our real needs, our real desires, our real fantasies, if you will, by studying how we utilize 2 resources, our time and our money. He's studied advertisement. He's looked at how are we spending our time and our money, because we don't part with those things very easily. If you're going to part with your money and your time, you're going to think a little while, and it's got to be worth it for you. You got to think there's some real value there. And as he did this, he approached it from a variety of levels, but one area you might find interesting. He started out by looking at what are the periodicals that men and women buy. And he thought, if I could see which magazines are most desired, that is, most people are willing to buy in the sexes, I'll find out what their values are. Because what we purchase, what we're willing to spend time on, what's most popular in the culture, makes a statement generally about what's most important to us. The number 1 magazine bought by men in America and the number 1 magazine bought by women in America is radically different. What would you guess the number 1 selling magazine is for men in America? No, it's not Sports Illustrated. Nope, it's not Time Magazine. It's Playboy. Can you believe that? And guess what number 2 is? Take a wild guess. Penthouse. Now, what about women? Is the number 1 magazine that women purchase, is that Playgirl? No way. Number 1 is Better Homes and Gardens. What's number 2? Family Circle. These purchasing patterns represent different desires in the culture. Now, does that mean that all women want better housekeeping and all men want a naked woman in front of them? No, I don't think so. But as he developed his research, what he began to find is what we already know, that men and women have been conditioned to achieve the feelings of love and importance differently. They literally have different ways of getting to the same source. And as we begin this interview, I think you'll be fascinated, because the more we understand about our conditioning, about what the environment has done with us, and the way we go about fulfilling our emotional needs, we can help ourselves to feel more secure, more happy, and more loved, but we can also support the person we're in a relationship with. And so I think you'll find some of Dr. Farrell's insights absolutely brilliant. And you may disagree with some of them. I don't agree with all of them either. And I tell them that. And we have fun discussing and debating it. So it's not that they're the complete answers, but they may trigger you to come up with answers that work for your relationships and your life. So let's get to it. Let's meet Dr. Warren Farrell. This month, as I promised you, we have Dr. Warren Farrell as our guest. He's the author of The Liberated Man and his more recent book, Why Men Are the Way They Are. And Warren is considered to be one of the world experts in the relationships between men and women. For 20 years, he's been studying that relationship. And I know, Warren, you're working on your 3rd book now. What's it called?
The 10 Greatest Myths About Men.
That's fantastic. And I know you're right now under deadline, and I appreciate you taking the personal time to come and visit with us.
I'm really happy to do it.
That's great. Warren and I, by the way, have become friends for the last 2 or 3 years, and I feel really appreciative to be able to call you a friend, and I feel very respectful that even though we're close friends, that every time I meet you, I learn something new from you, and I'm excited for our listeners to be able to learn some things from you as well here. But I want people to know that your book, the last one especially, Why Men Are the Way They Are, not only being a national bestseller, but it was incredibly provocative in that it really stirred people up. It was quite different than the perspective you've offered in Liberated Man. And one of the things that I respect about you is your continuous growth. As long as I've known you, you're always making new distinctions. You started out, I think, as a person who was basically presenting almost purely a woman's viewpoint of the man-woman relationship. With Why Men Are the Way They Are, it's kind of the man's perspective. And I think maybe part of your expertise has come because you've been at both ends and you really have an understanding of both those areas. I'm kind of gushy about you because you're my buddy, but I want people listening to know this is not just my view of you in terms of your expertise. After 20 years of working with men and women and writing this book, you've gotten incredible acclaim. On the cover of Warren's book, Why Men Are the Way They Are, quotes say things like, the most important book ever written about love, sex, and intimacy. That's the New York Post. My good buddy Ken Blanchard, who you heard on the first Power Talk tape, said, the best book I've read on male-female relationships, superb and brilliant. Dr. Carol Castle, author of Swept Away, says, witty, provocative, and probing. I guarantee this book will leave you with a different understanding of men and women. Simply terrific. And maybe one more example, the most important book ever written for women. The most important book ever written for men, Dr. John Mooney, professor of Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. You've stirred people up with this, and what we should start with is giving people a little bit of background on what were some of the personal reasons that made you want to study the relationship of men and women originally, and then let's talk a little bit about what some of your insights are. So what did start you?
I can remember my mother cycling in and out of depression, and I can remember her coming out of depression when she just took a simple clerical job, and she had other adults to communicate with. And she had some money so that she didn't have to go to my father like a welfare recipient asking my father for a dole so she could control her own life. And I can remember being touched by that and feeling like there's no reason in the world why a woman should have to be, in a sense, going to her husband and asking for permission when she's an adult human being.
Right.
And I started to see that she was, how much a state of mind feeling powerful is. Here my mother was going to work, a relatively simple job, and feeling more powerful than she was when she felt imprisoned with kids at home, and she only had 2 children. And so I was really feeling like there's something missing here. And when the women's movement surfaced, and women's movement was saying, in essence, women can control their own life. They don't have to be at home only. That's fine if they want to be, but it's not an obligation. It suddenly made sense to me. And in the meantime, unfortunately, my mother had gone into a deep state of depression and had died. And I think probably on a very personal and emotional level, I started to hear this, perhaps in a way that's a little bit deeper than other people had a chance to hear. But more importantly than that, or as importantly as that, I was able to hear it and do something about it because my former wife was becoming vice president of IBM. She was controlling her life. She had her own source of income. And as a result of that, she said to me, if you need to take some more time out from your doctoral work and the women's movement is that inspiring to you, spend some time and do it. A lot of my male friends, my colleagues, were needing to support a family. They were not able to have the luxury of taking time out to change their doctoral dissertation topic, to reframe it, to turn it back into a committee 3 or 4 times like I had to do, take that extra half year to do that. I had the luxury to be able to sit back and look at the larger picture in life. And I had that luxury as a result of a woman supporting herself rather than me supporting the woman.
So as a result, you got involved in NOW at that time, right? NOW being the National Organization for Women.
Yes, I got involved with the National Organization for Women, and then I found myself listening to a lot of what they were saying. The women's movement was very impressed that I was listening rather than lecturing to them. They asked me if I would start some men's groups within the framework of the National Organization for Women. I did that. As the men's groups became successful and were producing men that were also listening, they asked me if I would run for the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City. And then I served on their board for 3 years and began articulating the women's perspective. And that's when I began to see that by articulating the women's perspective, I was getting a great deal of positive feedback from women.
Standing ovations.
Standing ovations constantly from women. But I also began to notice after a while that as I went back 4 or 5 years later to speak to the same groups again, that oftentimes I would notice that the women and men were broken up from each other.
The ones who'd listen to you.
The ones, yeah. Well, I mean, I don't presume to have had so much impact that I was the only cause in their breaking up.
I'm teasing.
Yes,
I'm
right.
teasing.
But nevertheless, I was saying to myself, I'm wondering here if I'm missing something. If maybe if I listened more carefully to the men would be showing up in larger numbers. I mean, I fooled myself into believing at the outset that the reason that there were 95% women in my audiences was because I was the only sensitive man in America, and all the rest of the men were Neanderthals.
Right.
And when I got up over that self-serving attitude, I had one of those rare moments of internal security. Where I finally allowed myself to say, well, maybe one of the reasons that men aren't showing up in such large numbers is because you aren't articulating something that rings true for men.
Right.
And so I started listening more carefully to my tapes of the men's groups I had started, and began to see that, in fact, men were saying things that I was barely hearing. And as I began to hear those and articulate those things to women, I began to see that my standing ovations were dropping off from women.
At least now.
Yes, at least at the outset.
Right.
But many women were coming up to me a few weeks later and saying, I took your perspective home and I tried it on my husband or I tried it on my boyfriend, and he was saying, oh, that's exactly the way I feel. Let me come to one of those meetings myself.
That's fabulous.
And so that was what started making me realize that if I was really going to help improve love between the sexes, I had to hear both sexes and get both sexes to understand what the other sex was not able to articulate for them.
I think the great value that I personally found in the book is it helped me to have a greater understanding of what men and women really need. For years, my own study has been everything that we need comes down to our survival, and then we move up to higher levels of needs, of values, security, self-esteem, etc. But what you did is how people go about meeting those needs. How do you go about meeting the need of surviving, meeting the need of self-esteem, meeting the need of feeling like you're in control of your life is quite different based on cultural conditioning. And so it's not so much that we have different needs at the end, we have the same needs, but there may be different means to get those needs that we've learned culturally. So let's talk a little bit about that. What is the difference in your research between what a man needs and what a woman needs, and maybe also touch on what a man communicates he needs and what a woman communicates they need, because many times people don't say what they really need.
Yes. Both sexes have to learn how to survive. We taught women and men very different ways of getting those survival needs met. We basically taught women throughout history to do some version of finding a man to protect her and to protect the children that she would produce. We taught men, in order to get survival needs met, you learn how to produce them for yourself, but once you've learned how to produce them for yourself, you are going to be deprived of some things, namely love and sex, until you provide not only for your survival needs, but women's as well.
And your children's.
Yes. And so what basically men started learning was very good survival skills. What women started learning was very good skills in finding men, especially the men who were the best survivors. And the men who were the best survivors were also the best protectors and usually the best killers. And so women started learning, find a man who is the prince, find a man who is a hero. The very word hero comes from the Greek word meaning slave, protect, and servant. The hero was the servant of the society, the servant of the woman, the slave to the woman and the society, who was willing to risk his life to kill the dragon for her and the children and the community. She learned to find a survivor. He learned to find love and sexuality. The culture learned to deprive him of sexuality and love until he provided those survival needs for women and the children. Okay, the next stage happened. In the process, we started depriving both sexes of something. We know that he was deprived of love and sexuality until he provided for her survival needs.
So he had to become a performer. He had to be the best.
He had to be a performer. She was also deprived of something. She was deprived of learning how to provide for herself. All of this made no difference until the 1960s in middle-class societies, because basically women figured out a way of finding a provider, and when she did, she cashed that in at the height of her beauty power. And
what do you mean by that?
Then we basically told women, get as beautiful as you can by whatever standards were in the culture for beauty at that time. And then when you're most beautiful, usually around fertility age, 15 to 20 or so, you'd better find a man then when you're at the height of that beauty power and cash that in, meaning cash it in, marry him or some version of that, and get him to promise you security and protection for the rest of your life. Now that worked for most cultures for millions of years. The woman was spending her life basically as a slave to the children and also provide nurturing needs and intimacy needs and sexuality needs for the man. And the man would provide security needs for the children and for the woman. And as long as that process occurred, both sexes were basically slaves. They were slaves to the next generation. Women were not men's slaves, and men were not women's slaves, but both sexes were slaves to the survival of the next generation. Okay. Then came the 1960s, and women looked at the situation, and they had been trained all their life to know that if they were beautiful, they could get their security, their survival locked in for a lifetime. But suddenly divorces threw them out in the workplace without such survival skills that men had. And they now had a 40-year-old body rather than a 20-year-old body, when the 20-year-old body was designed to get their security for life. And women were pretty upset and angry about that. But it was worse than that for women. Not only did they have a 40-year-old body when men were addicted for functional reasons to the 20-year-old body, but they were usually not just a woman. They were women oftentimes with 2 or 3 children. Wow. So they were now asking a man not just to marry a woman, but a package. And the man saw the law, and the law said if you marry her, you have to support those 2 or 3 children as well. And so the deal didn't look very good for him. If he was successful enough to support the 2 or 3 children, he was also successful enough to go after his addiction, the beautiful woman.
Why are men supposedly addicted to the beautiful one, quote unquote?
Men learned to be addicted to the beautiful woman because every society learned that they had to have some incentive for the man to be willing to risk his life to die for the woman and the children. And so they built up the image of the beautiful woman because the beautiful woman in every society represented the genetic best. Not to manipulate the man, not for the women, but because the issue was the survival of the next generation. The beautiful woman was supposedly the genetic best, and the man who could kill, provide, and protect was the genetic best of the males. You put the 2 of them together, and you have the best genes with the best protectors for the next generation. However, in the 1960s, people said, hey, guess what? You know, the issue is no longer producing more children. And men and women were saying on a personal level, I don't want to just marry the best killer, the best survivor. I don't just want to marry a beautiful woman who is just focused on children. I want a woman who's intelligent, creative, confrontive, and loving, and kind and caring, and really loves me, and would love me even if I wasn't such a killer provider. It would love me if I was a warm, tender person who was earning maybe even less money than she was. So both sexes went into crisis, and when they went into crisis, they got divorces. But here was the trick of the divorce. We gave women divorces, but women were divorced without learning how to create survival skills.
In terms of earning security
and
income.
Yes, and here's the big missing link. Men and women got to the place where they were able to ask what I call stage 2 questions, questions of love and values and spiritual connection. We got to stage 2 once we learned to survive. But it was really only men that we taught how to develop survival skills. So we got women to ask stage 2 questions and have stage 2 values, but as soon as they finished asking them, they often said, I want a divorce from my husband, but then we threw them out into the workplace without the survival skills that gave them the ability to ask those questions to begin with.
So in other words, let's see if I'm understanding
that's
you.
the key link here. Yeah. Right,
so let's see if I'm understanding you. So what you're saying basically is that all of a sudden we're in a situation in society where survival is not the issue. And all of a sudden women are looking over and they're seeing this man behind a newspaper or is watching television. And she's saying, you know, he's not intimate, he's not loving me, he's not giving me my deeper needs. Survival's not the question anymore. Men maybe are doing the same thing, looking across saying, gosh, I'm working so hard, she doesn't understand who I am, I don't have the love, the intimacy I want. So they both say, I want something more. And all of a sudden they choose a new vehicle called divorce.
Yes, but she was able to ask those questions because her survival needs were taken care of. But after divorce, oftentimes her survival needs were not taken care of.
Meaning economically.
Economic needs, right. So she's often back in stage 1 worrying about survival.
I see.
But we've taught her to ask stage 2 questions without adequately teaching her how to provide for stage 1 needs, survival needs.
So a woman now is in the marketplace, she's 40 years old, let's say, by using your example, and she's in a place where she hasn't been trained to be in that marketplace of jobs. She doesn't know how to compete. The man has been trained his whole life. You're to compete, you're to be the best, here's how you beat other men, here's how you're supposed to be number one, and it's an unfair situation. And that's where you're saying the women's movement basically started.
Yes, the women's movement started there and said, hey, the workplace is not providing enough for the woman. But the fallacy was that they started blaming men for not paying women equally, when in fact women hadn't paid equal dues into the workplace. Women
they had in life.
They absolutely had in life, but they hadn't done it in the workplace. What we all needed to do was to make a transition, because men were not making more in the workplace because men had more power. Men were making more in the workplace because they learned they wouldn't get love until they earned more than the women earned in the workplace.
I see.
The degree to which men earned more in the workplace was an indicator of what the men needed to do to compensate for their powerlessness, to compensate for, in other words, a man couldn't get a woman's love by earning the same as a woman earned in the workplace.
Well, give me an example of what you mean by that.
Okay, a man who was a secretary and who was earning enough to support himself learned, if I'm a secretary or I'm a receptionist, I'm not going to get a woman's love. A woman's not going to take me home on Thanksgiving and Christmas and say to her mom and dad, I'm so happy I'm marrying a man who can support himself. He's a secretary. I want to marry him.
Parents are going to pull this daughter aside and say, let's talk.
They're going to say, honey, a few realities here. And if the parents don't do it, her women friends will do it. And so women get a very clean, clear message that don't marry a man who's earning less than you do unless it's temporary. He's going to law school or medical school, or he's preparing to earn more. He has potential. Marry a man who has potential. Those words are often not said directly, but the man picks up the message that if he's a doctor, he's a lawyer, he picks up the message that success is the best preventive medicine to avoid the cancer of being rejected by a woman.
So a man learns basically to get love through the process of performing and being the best and being the strongest.
He's been deprived of love and understanding until he is a good provider. When he's a good provider, we'll give him love and understanding and sexuality.
And if he's the best provider, the better the provider he is.
The better the provider he is, he runs into a catch-22. The more of a provider he is, the more he can get a woman of his choice to provide love and understanding. But the problem is, the better the provider that he is, the more likely he is to be away from home doing the providing and not around to benefit from the love and the understanding that he married a woman for in order to get.
You gave a classic example I remember reading in your book about the lawyer. Maybe you could relate that example here.
Yes, in fact, early in my work in this area, I worked with a man in a group named Ralph, who was a lawyer, and everyone in the group felt that Ralph had the most power of anyone in the group. But as we got to know Ralph very well, we began to realize that Ralph really didn't even like himself. He couldn't listen effectively to his wife because what he had learned as a lawyer was to argue a lot more than to listen. And he didn't like the fact that he was oftentimes supporting clients he didn't believe in. He didn't feel he had integrity with himself. Ralph in particular loved coaching baseball, but he learned very early in his life he was never going to be a baseball player and make $1 million doing that. So he learned to give up his love. He learned to give up the things he enjoyed doing with kids as maybe an elementary school teacher coaching baseball, and to go into something that earned income. So from his perspective,
he did this to be able to earn love, correct?
He figured out at an early age what he knew he needed to do in order to earn love. And one of the dilemmas that we're in as a world society at this point is that many men feel that they spent their life trying to earn the power and success that would bring them love, and they're being told that they're only interested in power, when in fact what they're interested in is love, and they knew that there would be no love until they got a reasonable amount of success and power.
Interesting. Well, what happened in this case with Ralph?
When I worked with Ralph and his wife, what became real apparent were that 3 things were at stake. One was his attitudes toward work had to change. And he said to me, as long as my wife wants this better home, as long as she is, every time we pass a beautiful home on the ocean and a second home, and our friends have a second home on the island, on Long Island, and I keep hearing that message, I'm going to feel that I have to keep producing at a very high level.
In order to be loved.
In order to be loved, in order to be okay with the family. And we all knew that that only was true, not only of the wife's message to him, but it was also being fed on by the respect that he'd get at work for being a partner and so on. So he was getting it from both angles. And so he and his wife had to be clear that it was okay for them not to have that second home in Long Island, and it was okay for them not to have the best home in the neighborhood, but that it was more important for them to have love between the two of them than to have a home with him not in the home.
Yeah, I hear you.
And when Ralph knew that that message was coming through on every level from Mary, he knew that he then had basically himself to work on.
That's great. That's great.
And of course, he had a lot of work to do with himself. His own self-image was not just tapped into Mary's expectations of him, but was, I'll be respected more by my partners at work if I perform more. I'll be respected more by my dad if I perform more. My mom will say, my son, the lawyer, who has a home out in, and and she'll say that with a pride in her voice that I want my mom to have in her voice.
Right.
So Ralph had to work out that stuff, and Mary had to work out her mixed messages, and Ralph also had to work out the message that said, I'm going to be a better father if I send my daughters to Barnard or Columbia or some private school. Maybe I'll be a better father if I spend more time caring for around my children, and if they go to a state school that maybe costs a little bit less money, that's going to be a trade-off that's going to be okay for me to make. And when both Mary and Ralph learned the whole concept of trade-offs, rather than both thinking they had to perform to do it all, that was when we made the real breakthroughs with both of them.
I see. Because so many people in life go out and they achieve quote-unquote success, let's say men, and they get to the top, quote-unquote, and then they say, is this all there is?
Yes, and this is the midlife crisis for many men. They say, is this all there is? This selling product X for company Y, and losing my wife in the process, and for all practical purposes being a wallet to my children, who I notice come around me a great deal when they want more money for the next tuition payments and pay attention to me for a few minutes to entertain me then, but really I don't really feel that they want to know me and what my needs and feelings are, and maybe I'm also not around them enough to know them. And so the combination makes many men feel more like a wallet than a human being. And as men begin to learn that, they say, maybe what the midlife crisis is about is not a process of immaturity, but a process of tremendous potential for maturity. Maybe it's about my reevaluating my values and having the guts to say to my children, I don't want to be a wallet, and the guts to say to my wife, I don't want to be a wallet, but I want to take a career that's more meaningful to me, that's more integrity-based, and if I produce less income doing it, that's what being a man is about. Having the guts enough to say, I want your love by an integrity-based career that allows me to do what I want to be doing during the day at work, rather than producing money for somebody else to have an integrity-based life.
What can a woman learn from this if she believes that this is really what a man's feelings are?
When she says that this is what she believes to a man, the first thing that's going to happen for the man is he's going to start watching to see whether her behavior matches what she says. He's going to be as suspicious as a woman will be when a man says, I don't care about beautiful women at all. The woman who hears that is going to start watching what he's watching at the next party. And if he says, oh, beauty doesn't make any difference to me, but she notices him flirting with a beautiful woman, she's not going to believe a word he's saying. The same thing happens for a man who hears a woman say, I want you to run your life based on integrity and love and having more time with me. He's going to notice, is she admiring something that's more expensive? Is she flirting at a party more with a guy who's very successful and less with a guy who is a very caring, loving, listening man, but is not successful? He'll watch her behavior just like she watches his behavior for the cues as to what will bring him her love.
What I'm hearing you say, if I'm hearing you correctly, is that men and women have been conditioned throughout their lives for two different things. they both need the same things. They both need security. Men have been conditioned, boy, you better perform, you better be the best so you can eventually not only survive, but you can have love. If you do that, you're going to attract a woman, and you're going to attract her because she needs what you can provide in terms of security. A woman's been taught, boy, you better be attractive if you want to attract that man into your life and get him to commit to making you secure. You're saying the challenges then come basically when people go beyond security and beyond love, and the challenges happen for men when they say, gosh, I've worked all this time to make things happen. I'm making it happen, but I'm not getting the love because I'm not there to be there.
Yep. And also the skills that I've learned to be successful at work are oftentimes exactly the skills that have made me unsuccessful in intimacy.
Like what, for example?
For example, a man in any profession learns that if he listens for a couple of seconds, picks up the gist of what someone else is saying, and begins to form in his own mind's eye a flaw that the other person has or a contribution that he can make, he can get a boss's attention and often get a promotion. But he takes that same skill of what I call self-listening home, and his wife presents a problem that she has. He listens for a couple of seconds, picks up the gist of what she's saying, and he finds himself forming in his own mind's eye a contribution or a flaw. And he tells her, well, honey, what you should have done differently is, or what you did wrong was. She doesn't feel heard or loved. She feels lectured to and condescended to. And so she doesn't feel like she wants to bring problems to him anymore. She finds herself bringing problems to her woman friend. And this creates a double dilemma for both sexes.
This program is continued on the opposite side.